All right, I am joined by the incredible Dr. Roberta Masa today, and we're going to be talking about a very near and dear prayer to many Christians' hearts, the Sub Tuum Praesidium. But before we dig in, I want to introduce the incredible Dr. Roberta Masa. Roberta Masa was born in Rome, obtained a PhD in papyrology at the University of Bologna. She now teaches papyrology and Greco-Roman Egypt at the University of Manchester and has published several articles on papyrology, as well as an academic book. She co-curated an exhibition of papyri portraits and Egyptian contemporary art at the John Rylands Library in 2012 and is honorary curator of the Greco-Roman Egypt Antiquities of the Manchester Museum. Her research has been covered by The Guardian, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and The Times, and she's been interviewed by the BBC multiple times. Dr. Masa, it is an incredible honor to have you here, and I'm blessed to be here with you to get to talk to you about this today. You have an incredible resume. Thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure when I get a chance to talk about our papyri collection. And actually, I know that we will be talking about one of my favorite pieces in the Rylands Library.
Yeah, so when we look at the Sub Tuum Praesidium, it is a very popular, can we call it a manuscript? Is that possible to call it that? Or
it is a manuscript. Okay. Of course, when people think about manuscript, they have in mind huge books, but this is also a manuscript. So it's very fragmentary, as you can see.
Yeah.
It was brought back from Egypt to England by Randall Harris, who is was a scholar in early Christianity, among other things. But since it was bought on the antiquities market in 1917, more or less, we don't know anything about where it was found, and that is a huge, problem, because besides having just words with a lot of holes, we don't even know where actually the papyrus was found. So we don't have an archaeological context for something which is an object.
Wow.
First and foremost, it's an archaeological object more than a text.
Yeah, and let me double check with you. Would this be a correct translation of what actually is said in that papyrus? It says
more or less.
More or less.
What you have actually in this slide is, of course, not only a translation, obviously, from actually a version of a prayer that we received in its complete format through the Latin, but also, when we look at our papyrus, we only have few words.
Yeah, and, I can tell. Yeah, I can tell.
Yes. So what the editor of this text did was reconstructing a lot of what was written on the basis of what we know about the famous beneath thigh protection, that is the Sub Tuum Praesidium, which is a very important prayer for the cult of Mary, of course. So we have always to bear in mind that philologists and papyrologists use later evidence to fill sometimes the gaps of what we actually have in one text. However, it should be highlighted that indeed there is the title Mother of God, clearly written Theotokos in this as you can see in what is line 3. Yes, fantastic.
Right
and that is a remarkable hint into the content of the prayer. So it's a reliable edition, of course.
Now, I know, and we can talk about that in a little bit, I know that there's a bit of difficulty in dating it. I know that I've read about that. I've read your incredible work, and I recommend anybody check out anything you've written. You've done incredible work in many different areas. But I look at that, and in your opinion, why is it so difficult to perhaps give it a date? And I'm curious, do you have an opinion as to the century, maybe?
Okay, so as you can see, this is a small piece of papyrus with, words written to report the prayer in a very sort of calligraphic way. So the person who penned this text was very keen on making, the letter very clear, squared, and there is a sort of monumental, somehow, inscription kind of style in this type of writing. However, what you can see is that there's no date on such a leaflet. So how can we date papyri like this one that are written in a literary or anyway very inscription style kind of handwriting without having a date on it? And this is a huge problem. So what papyrologists do in such occasions is to go through the immense archive that we have, accumulated in the course of time through our findings, and check the similarities between this handwriting and others. Now, of course, there is a challenge in this, that is, I can eventually find a handwriting similar to this, but it will be hardly in a papyrus with a date. That is, usually literary papyri or amulets or literary and semi-literary texts are not dated. So what papyrologists are also doing is trying to find texts that not only are similar, but have a date on it. In the case of these manuscripts, it is really even more challenging because, as I said, this is an handwriting which is very peculiar. That is, it has this alpha here, I don't know if you see it, with this sort of, triangular, reverse,
I can
which
see it.
is basically unattested in papyri securely dated, while other aspects are compatible with, for instance, documentary texts issued by offices of governors in Egypt towards the end of the 3rd century CE, but again, only some of them. Other are more into the 4th century CE. So there are features that are consistent with the 3rd century, but also others that are consistent with the 4th. So my opinion in these cases is to widen the discussion to the historical, context, And to me, it makes more sense to think about the 4th century, that is the century in which Athanasius of Alexandria, for instance, was saying a number of things about, Mary as the mother of God. But I can't, there's no definitive proof that this papyrus is dated indeed at the 4th century. It can be later or earlier. So it's a bit of a problem indeed, which we perhaps one day will solve through scientific analysis. But at the moment, we are a little bit stuck because, as you may imagine, to pick a piece of this fragment and bring it to the laboratory for C14 carbon dating is a challenge, because you have to, take off a little fragment. And also the other problem is that in this way I can date when the papyrus was produced, but not when it was penned, right? Yeah. So it's a bit of a problem. Another method can be Raman spectroscopy, which is non-invasive sort of imaging technique that allows us to figure out the recipe of the ink. But again, we don't have enough data then to be certain of when the ink was made and then used. So it's a sort of, we are making progress, but we are a little bit stuck in cases like these. Of course, the other thing that might happen is that among the many fragments that are still waiting to be studied in our libraries worldwide, something will come up and will help us to, somehow discover something about the date.
Now, you've written a lot of incredible stuff, but in particular, when talking about this document, you have said that the methodology of dating it, that we've got to be quite careful and we have to be meticulous, careful in what we say. You have noted that one has got to be, they have to use proper methodology. Have you noticed that there are some, perhaps manners of trying to date it that maybe people do not use proper methodology?
I think besides using this piece, well, the Rylands Library is a place where apparently a number of the most ancient fragment of, as you know, the Gospel of John, and then the most ancient fragment of the Sub Tuum Praesidium, and so forth, so on, at some point we're somehow gathering all together. So people like myself, but also I'm thinking about Brent Nongbury, Malcolm Choate, other people who have worked on this problem, have started thinking that perhaps there is a tendency, especially from scholars of early Christianity, to have a big wish somehow to find the most ancient of all the fragments connected with Christianity. So I'm thinking that, and then to pick up, a certain date which is more convenient to prove a certain thesis, which is, in my opinion, what was a little bit coming out from the reading of the fantastic work that has done Shoemaker on the cult of the Virgin Mary. That is, he decided somehow very conveniently that the best date provided was that of Lobel, who helped out Roberts in the first edition of the fragment, that was keen on a, I don't remember, I think early 3rd century CE. But that is not the way of proceeding, also in view of the fact that when this fragment was published in 1938, the pool of evidence that these scholars had was far less than we do have now. So I think that this tendency of picking up one date in such a convenient way somehow to your arguments is a little bit must be avoided. And I'm not saying that it's bad scholarship. Actually, Shoemaker is a fantastic scholar, but I think that we need to pay a lot of attention, also because, to be honest, this fragment has received dates that vary from the 3rd century up to the late antiquity. I don't recall precisely, but I think 8th or 9th century is one of the last proposals. So when you discuss this issue, you need to give account of all the hypotheses on the plate, and really to engage also with the last proposals, because, as I said before, we now have far more papyri to contrast and compare with this text.
That's a fantastic answer. When looking at the particular Greek word Theotokos, I've always been fascinated that you don't find that particular word in the Bible. But if we look at the Gospel of St. Matthew, we look at where we read that the prophecy of a virgin will give birth to a child called Emmanuel, which means God with us. And you have the Greek for God, you have the Greek for God, of course, and then you have the Greek for bearer. Now, whereas you can extrapolate that very same meaning, Mary as God bearer, you don't have that particular word there. And you look in early church history, you might have the theology you can get from the early church fathers, but that particular word, I remember talking to you not long back, thinking that it was in Hippolytus, and that is quite contested. In fact, I've had to, as you've pointed out, the number one thing we have to do is be honest. We have to not try to put forth information that strengthens your arguments or your theology. If there's holes that can be poked in it, we've got to be doing this to be honest. And if I'm going to be honest, I've had to remove Hippolytus from my library of early fathers that I believed used it, because there's too many that contested being an actual work from him. But when we talk about that theologically being biblical, and then we look at this document, you're saying it's possible it could be 3rd, it's possible it could be 4th century. Now, is it possible that that there are other figures that maybe utilized it at an earlier period because the theology was already present there in the Bible? Is that, I guess, any of that's really just speculation, I imagine. But what do you think about that?
So I'm not a theologian. I am someone who is very much invested in the study of early Christianity in the context of the Roman Empire. So I'm very interested in the historical study of Christianity. And what I think is that when we discuss about topics like these, there is a tendency to speculate a lot about, you know, all what these men were thinking about, what people need to believe, while on the ground, people were practicing, right, religion, and were looking for gods or divine beings that somehow filled their needs. So I imagine that for women, for instance, it was really important to find figures to relate with when, you know, perhaps adopting this new religion, or perhaps mixing this new religion with old beliefs. So I don't struggle in seeing, let's say, a woman in 2nd, 3rd century Egypt thinking about the Mary of even the, you know, the canonical gospel, but of course, and we have, you know, the proto-evangelium of James that is even more appealing in that sense, and thinking, oh, the mother of God the mother of Jesus, this Mary, is very interesting, and it's a maternal, right, figure, and in the experience of women, especially in antiquity, even more than now, maternity was a key moment of their life and really part of their identity. In Egypt, in particular, this figure was embodied by Isis, that was represented as a mother with a child on her lap, and very often as Isis lactans, so feeding the child to the breast, was appealing somehow as a figure, a maternal figure. So I can see how, you know, the transformation, well, the exaltation, can we say that, of this, the figure of the Virgin Mary, and later transformation could have appealed to women and others. Let's remember that according to some scholars, the Isaac religion was actually the most spread one in the 2nd century Roman Empire. So really a competing religion for Christianity.
Those are really, really good points. Just to be clear with you, just to be clear and on the same page, you're not arguing that the Mary of the scriptures pretty much borrowed elements of Isis or any of these pagan goddesses, but you're saying that later early Christians, as they became Christian and as they converted, that perhaps them seeing this figure of Mary, this important figure, they were able to relate more without having so many issues with their newfound faith. Is that more or less what you're saying, or?
Yes, more or less. And I'm also perhaps saying something slightly different. That is that what we find in the scriptures as we read them today is not necessarily how people experienced religion in antiquity. And these should not be bothering people so much. I know
it really
that
shouldn't. I agree, because the reason
because it's not a threat to any of you know, the theological points that some of us, not all of us, are so keen on defending, because it's not necessary. But I wonder why at some point, for instance, in 431, it was deemed necessary to establish that there was this cult and it should be performed in a certain way, that the title was that one.
I think for me,
yeah,
I can tell you, looking at it from a theological perspective, I think that Cyril of Alexandria was, actually, I don't think I know, he was quite upset with the Nestorian heresy. And I think it was very much to protect Christology and to battle back what the heresy was from Nestorianism. But I agree that your point was great. And I think it's great for, and in no way at all are we disparaging any other group of Christians, but for Catholics and Orthodox who we don't say, okay, well, if it isn't found in the scripture, our faith falls apart. No, we don't say that. Our faith is a living faith. So there should be no problem saying, well, look, we have this incredible image of Mary in the Bible, but the early Christians also lived a life where there are things that they practiced and things that they taught in a much more explicit manner. So I don't think there's any problem with that at all. People should not be bothered by that. It should not threaten their faith.
Yes, I agree with this. And also there is always a sort of disconnection between, those who were so worried about Christological and other theological problems and those who were living, their everyday life and perhaps didn't bother at all about these huge questions that were also political questions, as we know, because of course it was also a power game, the one that Athanasius of Alexandria, for instance, was playing, right?
Yeah, no doubt. I think that although I don't quite remember if and you can fill my memory in here, I don't think Arius ever contested the title Theotokos. But I do know that they were arguing many other things. And I do know that St. Athanasius was a fiery theologian, fiery saint, and really opposed Arius and the Arians. But I guess the other question that does come up very often, and I'm just curious your thoughts, would this prayer have been used in perhaps a church service? Do we have any evidence of that at all? Or we really don't, we just simply don't know, right?
This particular leaflet, you mean this fragment?
Yeah, correct.
Again, we can make different hypotheses. One is that it was a sort of prayer amulet, that is one of these small piece of paper, let's call it paper, that people asked to be inscribed perhaps by specialists or monks.
So it could have been an amulet then.
It could have been an amulet in the sense of a prayer amulet, that is as those, small figure, as the figure that you've shown me before, that is, you have this little piece of paper with a prayer on the back that you pick up when you go to a church. A Catholic church is a very, very common practice. Or perhaps it was hung somewhere for protecting the house. Another possibility is that actually it was written to be a sort of model to inscribe, let's say, a tombstone or the wall of a church or a place where, the early Christians were gathering together to do what they used to do. So there are different hypotheses that we can make. Yes, but it's a prayer.
Yeah.
Okay.
You brought up a very a very good point a little while ago when talking about Mary, and you brought up the Proto-Evangelium of James. Now, as far as I know, the dating around 150-ish, I don't think that's very much contested, is it?
I'm not an expert
Okay.
on this text, and I don't feel comfortable.
No problem. Yeah, no problem at all.
But again, yes, as you know, for any other early Christian text, there is a huge discussion about it. I don't have problems in seeing it as an early, actually text. For sure, you know, this attention to Mary grew in the course of time and took different paths, so to speak. So yeah.
Now, what do you mean by different paths? Because a Catholic, I can tell you from a Catholic and an Orthodox perspective, a Catholic and Orthodox would say, they'll say, okay, well, in the early church, and this is not a problem, they'll say there in the apostolic era, there's not a whole lot about Mary being written in the early church fathers, but they'll make a note that once Constantine legalizes Christianity, that all sorts of writing, Christological writings, Mariological writings begin to explode, and we have a ton of them. Could that perhaps be one of the things that you mean? Because then some people will say, well,
yes.
Okay.
I think, well, you know, I have some ideas about the fact that when Christianity increasingly became, you know, an expression of the political power, then there was a need of figures. And also Mary somehow was, in my opinion, transformed to become a sort of model for the empress, right?
Okay, yeah.
So the emperor was the sort of alter ego, or anyway, Jesus was the model for the emperor, and then the empress had to conform to a figure that Mary was really somehow appealing.
So that's a great point.
So, you know, yeah, well, if you think about, there is another object that I'm very, very attached to in our library, which is, well, actually, it's an ivory cover. It was part of a cover of probably a gospel, or anyway, a liturgy book. It has been dated to the 6th century, more or less. One side has Jesus enthroned. The other side has the Virgin Mary enthroned with the child on her lap. So in a sense, and this was most probably like an imperial or highly aristocratic kind of object, right? So, and I think that there is an appeal, yes, to see, you know, the emperor as Jesus on earth, somehow, someone who needs to behave like Jesus, and the empress as someone who is following the example of the Virgin Mary. So, but this is something, you know, that has to do with the politics.
Yeah, no doubt at all. Yeah.
So, and I think that, you know, Christian writers, the one who produced then theology and so forth, so on, somehow played with all these ideas, while the people on the street were actually perceiving these figures in another way. As we do today, if you think about, you know, how, let's say, American president talk about God and Jesus and the New Testament and how the people, the everyday normal people are living religion, it's very different. It's very different in my opinion.
Yeah, no doubt. It very well can be, but let me trying to think of an early church writer, because when we think of the incredible artwork, without a doubt, it would have been done by an emperor, most likely, right? Because these early church fathers wouldn't have had the money to have been able to produce something like that. What they have, I think a number of them. I think of Saint Athanasius or Ambrose. I don't think any of those would have had the kind of money to produce that kind of a piece, right? It would have had to have been royalty, I imagine.
Yes, very, very expensive covering of a book that was perhaps gifted to a church, but you know, the commission was from someone like an emperor or a member of the imperial entourage to have that kind of money. Nevertheless, it could have ended right in the hands not of your, you know, 4th century or 3rd century church fathers, but those, you know, bishops.
Right, later on in
yes,
church history.
we are in the 6th century. So my point was about the transformations that Mary went through. She became also a queen, right, as Isis before. So it's very interesting.
It is, but let me add this. Let me, and of course the theology in me comes out, and a Catholic or an Orthodox would say that Mary is presented in a queen-like manner in the book of Revelation, the woman crowned in heaven.
Exactly.
So, right. So just to be certain with you, you're not saying that this was later invented. You're saying that
No, it was something, of course, aspects that you can find throughout the scriptures and the tradition were stressed in a way or another accordingly to, you know, the aims and perceptions of. I'm not saying that. Yes, of course.
That's perfect, because just to clarify.
I wonder, you know, you can find anything you want in a sense in the Bible, right?
It depends. It depends. If we stick with what the early church fathers say, they had a very interesting view of the book of Revelation 12, that woman, because the woman is the mother. We read of the woman crowned in heaven, and we don't read a whole lot about her other than in that particular chapter, but she's the mother of the Messiah. So the early church they understand, well, she's the mother of the child that will rule the nations. That child is Christ. Of course, early on, we don't have a lot of commentaries on that in the book of Revelation, but I think that had to have played a part in such beautiful imagery later on. Now, I don't argue. I think you're right. You make a fantastic point. Well, this other imagery existed of Isis and other figures, and they then would have utilized similar imagery of Mary, not because the Bible stole from pagan goddesses, but because it became transferred. It became the religion that was being practiced, and they utilized artwork that would have been familiar to them. Would that be correct?
Yes, and I even wonder, talking about Revelation and who this woman was, are you sure that everyone reading that passage when it was, you know, written was thinking, this must be Mary, the mother of...
No.
So that is the point. That is... we tend to read and what makes different my job from the job of a theologian is that I am looking at this material as sources to investigate how people experienced religion at that time. So I'm not that interested in, I mean, of course I am interested, but I am more curious in you know, the theological debate of, let's say, Athanasius or any other of guys. But as a historian, I am much more interested in the average
no doubt,
the ancient world. And another point which I think it's important sometimes to remind is that Christianity was not that successful because of people like Athanasius. I think that Christianity was that successful because it sounded somehow, sounded in some kind of way in the people everyday experience.
I got you. Yeah, it resonated with the people.
ISIS, in a sense, prepared the way to the Virgin Mary. You know what I mean? That is.
Yeah, I know what you mean. You mean that
there was something about that religion, and then of course there are different things. Of course, it was a big thing when Constantine decided, you know, this religion, I like it, whatever he did or he did not do, or if not Constantine, let's say his dynasty, right, decided somehow to, and that had a huge impact, but it doesn't explain all what happened and the success.
Yeah, you're right, because it could have very well died out, but it didn't. You have a really good point there. Many religions, you would have thought that maybe a century or two later would have died out. But I think you make up a really good point. I think you were trying to say that the Christian religion, it resonated with the people. People were able to identify with it. Even people, perhaps converting from paganism, maybe they would have said this is appealing because, not because Christianity has ripped off from paganism, but because there are elements that they understood. Would that perhaps be correct? Elements that they would have,
Yes, at some point is this. Yes, at some extent is this is what I was arguing. Yes, and also I do think that perhaps people had more than one affiliation. I mean, it's really an interesting world, the world that has seen, you know, the start and then the history of Christianity going on and develop.
Yeah, no, and by the way, earlier you brought up a very good point, because I've done a lot of research, and it sounds to me like you've done some research in Revelation 12 as well. Or am I? Or no, you haven't.
No. Well, I have. And I have read these texts, but I'm not an expert at all.
Okay, yeah, you'd be correct. It was by far, it was not unanimous. You didn't have every early father seeing Mary there. You have a number of them viewing the woman as a representative of the church, and then some of them recognizing it as being Mary. But it's fascinating. You know, it's very fascinating. You know, all of this discussion, it's been a great discussion. You know, and I don't want to take up so much more of your time. I've really enjoyed dialoguing with you. You know, I'd like to give you, you know, any other thoughts you have on the Sub Tuum Praesidium before, you know, before we can wrap up. Do you have any?
I feel that now I'm very curious, you know, to work a little bit more on this fragment. But
and you know what I'm going to do? I'd love to. I know your expertise. You do other things, but I imagine you also like to read and study theology sometimes, right?
Yes, sure.
I'm going to get you a copy of a book that I co-authored on Mary. I'd love for you to check it out. Yes, definitely. I co-authored it with my co-author is, in my opinion, he's a top Mariologist. It's the Reverend Dr. Koppes, who wrote a book on Mary. I'd love for you to check it out.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yes, I would love for you to check it out. And before we do wrap up, I want to give you the floor to talk about anything you're working on. It doesn't have to be related to this. Anything. Do you want people to go to purchase a book or book you're working on? Check out a website. Anything. The floor is yours right now to put in a plug for anything that you're working on.
No, well, check out the Rylands Collection website. You can find me on academia.edu and also in my blog, which is called Faces and Voices, and is much more connected with another theme that I'm very keen on, which is the licit and illicit market in manuscript and how we can promote a more ethical publication of papyri. So yeah, that's it.
And
yes.
by the time this does air, on the bottom, I will provide a link to your academia.edu.
Thank you.
I definitely recommend people go. And I want to tell people, I've read some of Dr. Massa's material. This is fantastic. It is very fair. And I really do recommend it. Dr. Masa, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
William, I really enjoyed our conversation.
And I look forward to dialoguing with you again in the future. You're always welcome here, and I will be in touch. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks.